Should we go ahead and start?
Sure.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to introduce Ana Maria Osula, who is a global digital governance fellow here at Stanford University. My name, by the way, is Andy Grotto. For those dialing in, I lead the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance here at Stanford University. Ana Maria is with us this quarter. We're thrilled to have her here. She's a senior researcher at Tallinn University of Technology and a senior policy officer at Guardtime. Her current research focus is cyber diplomacy and international law applicable to cyber operations. She also serves as a research fellow at Masaryk University under the project Cybersecurity, Cybercrime, and Critical Information Infrastructures Center of Excellence. Previously, she worked as a legal researcher at the NATO CCDCOE, which I believe I may have met you there once. Yeah, we need to come back to that. Oh, great. Well, maybe we should start over.
No, I think it was something that you pushed at the end of Andy's.
All right,
okay?
maybe it was this. All right.
Hey, June, did you catch my introduction? June was my thesis advisee. Yeah,
all right.
Okay, awesome. Great. Okay.
Sorry, it was probably then this one. So then I would just repeat that before I start introducing my research project, and hello everybody online and offline. I would like to thank Andy, and I would like to thank Lizzie from Stanford University Libraries for making this happen, because without their support, I would not be here enjoying my time and doing excellent research here in Stanford. So thank you for this. And like Andy already explained, I have been working in different domains. So I have experience from the research community, from the NATO Center. I've been working in academia, and I've been working in the private sector. And during my research in the NATO Center, I had the opportunity also to take part in the negotiations together as a part of the delegation on the Estonian Minister of Foreign Affairs. So in 2015, I was in the United Nations headquarters together with then Ambassador Marina Kaljurand, and I was able to see the processes, the negotiations being held in the UN level very closely. So this makes my interest in this topic in cyber diplomacy very multi-layered, and I'm really fascinated about the topic, since I've seen it from the government viewpoint, albeit in a limited scope, from the academic viewpoint, and then from the perspective of the private sector. So putting these three perspectives together, I really find this topic, cyber diplomacy, and especially the role of multi-stakeholders, a fascinating field of research. In my presentation today, I will introduce my research project. I will explain what is the research problem, or what is the urgency in looking into these topics. I will introduce the private sector role in the negotiations at the United Nations level, and I will draw conclusions or preliminary remarks on what I have learned so far during my research and during my interviews. So one of the main reasons why I am here in Stanford is that I'm able to conduct interviews with tech leaders. And besides the tech leaders, an important source for my interviews is also diplomats, former diplomats or current diplomats that are involved in those international negotiations. And unfortunately, because of COVID, then most of the interviews I have been able to have so far have been virtual, but hopefully I will be able to meet some people face to face in the coming weeks. And my research project will be finalized, hopefully by the end of this year. I will publish an article in the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, where there will be a special issue on cyber diplomacy. And this is also related to my background in Caltech, where I am involved in 2 projects on cyber diplomacy called CASPA and CyDiplo. So a lot of ongoing efforts in academia regarding these topics. So firstly, cyber diplomacy, a couple of words and remarks about the concept, because without understanding the concept, it is very difficult to make sure we are talking about the same thing. Well, firstly, diplomacy is a very interesting fluid concept that does not really have a commonly accepted definition. I love the library here because I've been able to look through all sorts of old publications and seeing what is being meant by diplomacy and what was meant by diplomacy 30, 40 years ago. And we see that the concept of diplomacy is in consistent development, so a constant development. So it is a fluid concept, and it has to be a fluid concept because it is influenced by the environment we are in and by the complex security challenges that the governments are facing. However, when we look at the, so to say, traditional approach to diplomacy, there are 2 keywords: negotiations, or the art of negotiations, and state-to-state communication. Now, in my presentation and in my research, I am questioning the state-to-state focus, because the argument is that we live in a networked environment where there is a large connection between different stakeholders. There are more and more stakeholders involved in cybersecurity. Hence, we cannot really talk about the narrow state-to-state approach when we talk about diplomacy and the foreign relations in the current world. So, of course, diplomacy is being shaped by the development of the modern state itself. And we know that in cyberspace, there are so many unique characteristics that come to play when we talk about the scope of the concept of diplomacy, or then cyber diplomacy. We have a complex security setting with different threats. We have more and more different threat actors with different characteristics. The attacks are becoming more sophisticated, more coordinating. And here in the US, there have been recently very serious incidents in that regard. So US is a great example of a country who takes cybersecurity and the general coordination of cybersecurity very seriously. We have strong powers with their own agendas, and we have clearly a situation where we see states battling for the power in cyberspace, battling for the power in governing cyberspace. And this has been recognized by all the large states, including the European Union, that has lately put a lot of more effort in kind of gaining a stronger foothold in governing cyberspace. ICT revolution, of course, has changed the way diplomats communicate, or the way they can express their views, the way they can influence their counterparts, but this is not the focus of cyber diplomacy. The focus of cyber diplomacy is the abundance of different threats and the specific characteristics of security. What has changed within the domain of diplomacy in this regard is that currently diplomats need to take into account so many different topics related to cybersecurity. And this is difficult because cybersecurity is not only about patching your computers, it is everything. It is how the internet is run, how the infrastructure is being protected, how the services, products are being built, what are the obligations of the states. So there is the increasing scope of diplomacy with so many different topics that need to be covered by current diplomats working in these issues. I read a study where more than 50 domains were identified which need to be covered by diplomats. And this is, of course, a great challenge for countries. For big countries like the States, yes, maybe you have more people, more opportunities, more resources. But for smaller countries like Estonia, where I'm coming from, this is certainly an issue. We don't have enough people to cover all of those different topics. We don't have the funding to take part in all of those different negotiations and events. So this is what I mean by the term illusion of inclusion. So in a way, yes, all these processes are open to all the states. Everybody's invited to sit there. Everybody's invited to express their opinion. But for smaller states, this is really an illusion of being able to be everywhere. So you need to define your priorities and need to make choices. And when we talk about the evolution of diplomacy, then definitely we need to also take into account public diplomacy, which has a stronger focus on not again the state-to-state communications, but state-to-population communication. And this definitely is clearly seen when we talk about cybersecurity. So just the final slide on the basic terminology, I would just like to point out that there are different terms that are being used, and they are being used in an inconsistent manner. So this creates a lot of confusion. But in very short, e-diplomacy is usually referred to using ICT as means of communication. And this is, in my view, a very narrow and limited view on diplomacy. Whereas tech and cyber diplomacy have a more broad view and encompass all these different topics. However, also there is a specific difference between those two. So cyber diplomacy is often referred to issues related to national security. So negotiations ongoing in the UN First Committee, for example, whereas tech diplomacy is more related to innovation, to regulating tech companies, to regulating products, processes, services, etc. So I've just recently had some interviews with some diplomats. So it is common for countries, many countries have already assigned either tech diplomats or cyber diplomats or both, because these are issues that, yes, are interlinked, absolutely no doubt about that. But at the same time, they cover so many different areas, so it's impossible really for one position only to cover all of this. So the focus of my research is then cyber diplomacy, focusing on the security level. And here I have just some examples from strategic documents where the word cyber diplomacy is clearly playing an important role. So the first one is from 2016 from the EU. And what is noteworthy here is that EU in 2016 already, and actually also before, clearly stated that cyber diplomacy and cyber issues are part of the foreign and security policy. So before there were debates on the national level, debates when the national cybersecurity strategies were being framed and put together, then where to really put cybersecurity, then this is not a debate anymore. So cybersecurity is part of the foreign and security policy. European Union, of course, has been more elaborate on cybersecurity. This example is from the cybersecurity strategy in 2020, where you have the cybersecurity toolbox, cyber diplomacy toolbox, together with then restrictive measures and other initiatives. So for the EU, this is definitely a clearly important domain in part of their international relations, but also amongst between the member states. And lastly, an example from the US Department of State, a very recent one that there has been adopted, or there has been the establishment of the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy. Yes, the term being used here might be digital policy, not cyber, but if you look at the different topics that this bureau is dealing with, then issues of cybersecurity are clearly there together with ICT policies and also human rights, which is a very, very important aspect. So far, I've explained the traditional understanding of diplomacy, state-to-state negotiations. I've explained the uniqueness of cybersecurity and the uniqueness of states attempting to govern cyberspace. And here I like this parallel with what Hawking was writing about in 2008. And he was calling it the multi-stakeholder diplomacy. So he's writing at that time was not targeted at ICTs or cyberspace at all. But already then he was saying that states alone are no longer able to achieve their objectives in isolation of other stakeholders. And in the context of cyberspace, it cannot be more true. It is clear that states alone are not able to ensure cybersecurity. You need the inclusion of other stakeholders, such as intergovernmental organizations, private entities, multinational companies, and also non-governmental organizations. So what I aim to do with my research is to analyze the multi-stakeholder diplomacy in the context of cybersecurity and kind of trying to break through an open door to prove something I deeply believe in, that cybersecurity is a multi-stakeholder affair. And I don't think I need to really explain the fundamental role of the private sector when we talk about cybersecurity. I already mentioned critical infrastructure, services, products. These are all being either developed or run by the private sector. Think about where is your data, who is holding your data, who has access to your data. So clearly, there is a very clear link with the private sector when we talk about cybersecurity governance. Now, what is interesting then is to look at multilateral negotiations on the United Nations level. So we have so far kind of advocated that, yes, private sector has a role, needs to have a role. There are many reasons for this. For example, the legitimacy of the cybersecurity norms, that how can those norms be followed if there is no buy-in from the private sector and different stakeholders. But what is the effect then of involving private sector in those negotiations? Now, I've had very interesting interviews and very interesting remarks on this matter. For example, there was one former diplomat who said, yeah, multi-stakeholderism is great. I definitely agree with this, but this should be limited and it should not go further than it is now. And why? His argument was that it has a detrimental effect, or it is endangering the multilateral system. And why is that? Because large multinational companies, not maybe, but are more influential in those negotiations than smaller states. And then if smaller states do not feel that they are being heard or that they have a voice, this can definitely have a negative effect on the negotiations. So there are different views on how should different stakeholders be involved. Should this involvement be limited or not? Should it be further encouraged, etc.? We can see when we look at history and when we look at other processes that multi-stakeholderism is here to stay. So more and more stakeholders are being involved, and I don't think we can reverse back this trend. But the question is how to make this work at the UN level. And this has to do with so many different challenges and different layers. For example, national borders. Cybersecurity is not defined to national borders. Cybersecurity issues are not focused anymore on nation states. So the concept of territoriality and the meaning of territoriality has changed so much that I think it is one argument is there that could be kind of carried on or could be elaborated on, is that the nation state itself is losing its original value and role in the international system. Now, on this slide, I have just brought out different challenges in cyberspace, and these terms are taken from the UN GGE documents. And I brought this out only here just to underline that the private sector has a role to play in all of these challenges, whether they are providing the infrastructure, whether they are providing the services, whether they are helping states or other stakeholders to mitigate the attacks, or to build resilience or to share awareness, etc. So private sector is everywhere, and it's also there where there are the attacks. So the tools that are being used for carrying out attacks or campaigns are also provided in some instances by the private sector. So here I just want to underline that we cannot kind of walk around the private sector, but we need to accept its role. What I like, one more concept I like about from Hawking, he was saying that multi-stakeholder diplomacy is relevant in order to assess the problems that the state has. So the state has issues with legitimacy, whether the agreements or rules or regulations provided by the state are actually being followed by different stakeholders or the population. Issues with knowledge, as we talked before, it is not feasible for the state to have all sorts of technical knowledge on very concrete issues such as encryption, and also access to information, access to information about the threat actors, threat patterns, etc. So these are the deficits that the state has that the private sector helps to fulfill. Now, and now a couple of words about the private sector initiatives. Well, to be honest, there are so many different initiatives out there that are concerning cyberspace governance in general. I'm trying to focus my research on cyber norms then reflecting politically binding voluntary agreements regarding expected behavior. So I hope that with this kind of a limitation of scope, my research can be more focused. But we can see that there are a number of private sector initiatives on national, regional, and international level, and I'm mostly interested in the international level. I will not go into too much detail with the different private sector initiatives. This will be the focus of my research here, but I bring out 4 most important ones and just share some of my remarks and comments on these. Paris Call is perhaps one of the most well-known initiatives, and interesting here and really noteworthy here that it's not only an initiative between non-state stakeholders such as the private sector, but it also has onboarded 80 states. Which is a big argument, again, to support the multi-stakeholder approach to cybersecurity. Paris Call has identified 9 common principles. I have picked some of them here, and their activities are then based on focusing on these principles and trying to promote them. Then Tech Accord is mostly focusing on private sector entities, more than 150 members. They have, again, a set of identified commitments and a set of values and a number of initiatives that they are undertaking in this regard. Both the Paris Call and the Tech Accord, the company where I'm working at, Guardtime, is a member of both. So I have the view into what's happening in these organizations also from the private sector. Then there is Charter of Trust. This is initiated by Siemens. You might think that 17 private actors, that's not a huge number, but it actually comprises of very important private sector entities. So the fact that they agreed that they need to have a common agreement on how to behave or how to develop their products online is noteworthy in itself. And again, they have a set of principles that they are following. And lastly, Microsoft is one of the most active players in this domain, and one of the initiatives, and there have been many initiatives supported and put forward by Microsoft, is the Geneva Convention, or the Digital Geneva Convention. And the idea there is that that governments have the obligation to protect its citizens also in peacetime. When the Geneva Convention itself focused on wartime, then their idea is to put forward on an obligation also to protect citizens in peacetime. This particular initiative has received a lot of criticism, but my own opinion on this is that I think it's great that they had this initiative, because I think it created a lot of necessary debate. Even if it was critique from the states, I think it's necessary to talk about these things. And Microsoft is one of the most active players in different levels. They're very active at the UN, but also on regional organizations. So, as said, the focal point of my research is the discussions on cyber norms in the United Nations. There is a lot being written about it, a lot of research done about it, books written about it. So there's no point for me to go more into detail in this, but I'm focusing my research on the role of the private sector in those negotiations. So there are 2 main processes ongoing, or actually there are more processes ongoing, but in 2 main committees. The first committee has United Nations group of governmental experts, a process I will introduce in a minute, and then the open-ended working group. And in the third committee, you have the Convention for Cybercrime. Now, I will focus on the first committee issues because of the relation to national security, but it's interesting to highlight here that in both of these committees, the multi-stakeholder question has been underlined, and it is clear that if you talk about either national security or cybercrime, you need to take into account the positions of different stakeholders. Now, this slide has a lot of information on it, but it's just maybe important to highlight the basics. that for some time you had two parallel processes, UN-GGE and the open-ended working group. Now the GGE process has been halted, and you have the open-ended working group, which has a mandate until 2025. So there are ongoing negotiations at the open-ended working group level. There is also a proposal for a permanent UN forum, the program of work, that has been tabled by some countries, but it's like the more details about this topic have not been confirmed. But there are so many different remarks I would like to make here, but I don't want to go too much into detail. I would just like to point out that open-ended working group in itself is a development, because it is a process that involves all the countries to be around the table, whereas the UN-GGE was limited to 15 or 25 countries. And hence it had a lot of critique, because yes, even though the countries were chosen on this geographical distribution, it still made several countries feel that they are not included in these discussions. The second remark I would like to make about the UN-GGE, that even though 6 GGEs were convened, then 4 reports were adopted. This means that twice no consensus was being found between the member states, even though we talk about 15 or 25 members. And it is interesting to see that when there was a lack of a report or a lack of a response, then there was like an effect of it was a clear increase of activity from non-state actors. You could see that from regional organizations or from NGOs, from the private sector. And I've written with my colleague Niklas an article about the role of regional organizations, and we proved that you can clearly see that a lack of agreement at the GGE level equals with more activities at the regional level. So in that sense, it's really crucial that the open-ended working group is successful in finding a consensus. But of course, clearly, if you have all the countries around of the world around the table, it is more difficult to reach a consensus anyway. So there are many issues and many open questions related to the open-ended working group. But one of the key topics related to my research is the inclusion of multi-stakeholders at the open-ended working group process. So in the beginning, the open-ended working group was being advertised as being very inclusive. Everybody is welcome. But now actually the reality is that currently the negotiations are having a huge debate about the multi-stakeholder inclusion. There are certain countries like Russia who are against involving multi-stakeholders on a more like open basis. And then there is a group of states, mostly Western states, who are supporting multi-stakeholder approach. So far, I think saying that the negotiations have been halted is too strong, but currently the negotiations are going on in an informal manner, because the Western states were saying that unless we solve the multi-stakeholder question, there will be no formal level negotiations. So it is very interesting to see how this plays out. And in my interviews, I have learned a lot about why this situation has been kind of formed, or how to deal with it. So currently the process is such that you need to have certain accreditation in order to be involved in the process, but the agreement for a stakeholder to be involved is happening on no objection basis, which means that if there is even one country who says that they are not okay with the stakeholder being involved, then the stakeholder is out. So this is clearly limiting the options for several stakeholders to be involved. So we can ask, why is this? Why are some states so strongly opposing this? And this, of course, has to do with all these challenges that I have mentioned, and many more elements that are part of this complicated puzzle that is called the governance of cyberspace. So many entities, many companies are strongly advocating for a more meaningful involvement of non-state actors. I just had an interview this morning before this presentation where someone who was part in these negotiations was saying that, yeah, I was there. I was taking part in those negotiations. There was a separate informal consultation. We were there delivering our remarks, except who was not there? Almost none of the governments were there. So then the process needs to be kind of designed in a way that would help the opinions and approaches from these different stakeholders to be also reaching the governments, right? So in order to summarize my research efforts, here are my basic research goals, and this is what I have been doing already, and that will form the kind of the backbone of my article, is analyzing the multi-stakeholder diplomacy theory in light of cyber diplomacy. I think I've covered the basic arguments that I've already made here. Then examine the diplomatic practices of the private sector. My aim is to gather the practices and categorize them, and to see whether the arguments that have been made in literature that are saying that private sector can be seen as a quasi-diplomatic actor, whether this can actually be substantiated, and also identify trends and challenges regarding several open issues in that regard. Here I have listed some of them, but there are many issues. First of all, there is certain imbalance. There are some of the actors that are private sector actors that are around that table are very strong. Many private sector actors are missing. You can see that there is an imbalance between the voice of the strong actors and then smaller companies. Smaller companies are not involved in the processes. Why is that? What is the goal of the private sector entities in being involved in these processes? How does this affect that you have the domination of certain actors? How does this affect the perception of nation states on these processes, and whether this has a hindrance on their opinions in involving multi-stakeholders? What are the structures for involving multi-stakeholders? How can we make these better? And issues related to the power of the stakeholders. Remember my remark about them being more powerful than smaller states. Also the need to have stakeholders in order to have legitimacy. So you have all sorts of pro and con arguments, which makes this topic absolutely fascinating for me. So with this, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm looking forward to your questions, whether online or offline. I'm also looking forward to having further conversations with any of you on these topics and taking in your remarks. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Anna Maria. I'll get us maybe kicked off with a question. And then for those of you who are on Zoom, why don't you just drop your question in the chat, and we will pause periodically to check and make sure that we're not missing questions there. So I was fascinated by your remarks on the evolution of the concept of diplomacy, and in particular how it's sort of this living term, and the multi-stakeholder dynamic around cyber diplomacy kind of challenges the state-centric thinking around diplomacy. When a company like Microsoft engages in these types of forum, I'd be curious for your perspective, and if you know, sort of, particularly vis-a-vis some smaller countries, on whose interests Microsoft or other companies represent, right? So states can purport to represent on some level their citizens. We could talk about, if they're democracies or not, how much of that is true, but at least in theory, the states are there to represent, a national interest that hopefully is aligned with the interests of their citizens. Private companies, operate primarily to make money, right? So I'd love your perspective on how that sort of dynamic play, especially among smaller countries. I mean, are they, when a company like Microsoft participates in a proceeding like this, is it that they view Microsoft as just an extension of U.S. interests, or as sort of an extension of corporate interests? Would love your thoughts.
Thank you so much, and it's a great question. And of course, as you know well, there is no right or wrong answer to this. And your question has so many different layers. So I'll cover some of these topics. I'll start from the end. You asked whether Microsoft is viewed as an extension of the U.S. views. In my opinion, no. In my opinion, it is clear that Microsoft has its own agenda, has its own goals. Topics such as the initiative, such as the Geneva Convention, I don't think the US was supporting this openly. So clearly Microsoft is doing their own thinking, and Microsoft is a unique creature, so to say. What is unique about Microsoft is also the strong role of the visionaries, the strong role that the high-level officials are playing in this regard, and their vision. So it is really one of the driving force behind Microsoft being so active in these negotiations. Clearly, I think we need to accept this from the very beginning, that a private sector entity, the prime goal is profit, or to extend their client base, or issues related to that. For example, being a more credible partner, being a more trustworthy partner. And especially, I would say that this fora, the UN, is a great platform for them, because you're talking with the governments of the whole world. And is the US using Microsoft in their ministries, in their institutions? Probably yes. Is Estonia using Microsoft? Of course. So clearly there is a clear, like this client or this customer private sector role here. A lot has been written about Microsoft. There have been articles specifically focusing on Microsoft, asking the same questions. What is the goal? And several articles have found that, yes, of course, Microsoft, as any private entity, would be interested in the client base, trustworthiness, and reputation. But it also has a certain set of moral values. And looking at the activity or the level of activeness of Microsoft, and it is investing so much in different initiatives, including capacity building, including awareness raising, all these things that are not directly giving them profit. So the argument can be done that you have kind of two sets of goals, of course, the profit-based or the customer-focused goals, but then also kind of the moral values. But one more thing I wanted to add on this is that when I started looking at the concept of cyber diplomacy, then what really interested me in the very beginning was the relation between cyber diplomacy from the perspective of the private sector versus lobbying, versus advocacy. So is there really a difference between these when we look from the perspective of private sector, or are they roughly the same things? So of course, private sector prefers to use the term cyber diplomacy, right? Or government affairs. If their unit would be called lobbying unit, then this would not really work out well. But I mean, I think everybody reads between the lines regarding the objectives, but I would just want to point out that in the context of Microsoft, it is not only like profit-based. That's my opinion. Of course, one more element with Microsoft that we need to talk about is the way Microsoft is. One thing is how it's behaving itself, but then its support towards the other organizations or countries or NGOs. Its funding and direct support, and how this then influences or does not influence the way the NGOs behave, what are their main messages, etc. So if you look at the funding schemes, then you would see that many entities being present at for example, the Open Ended Working Group, and those who have delivered their positions do have a smaller or bigger connection with Microsoft. So many issues there.
Just one quick follow-up. Fascinating thing about the high-level interest coming from Microsoft. And if Brad Smith retires, does it go away? I mean, because he has been the face of it, certainly, and I could see that he's also a moral driver behind it. So do you have any sense of, I mean, it's almost like the board is saying, well, you're doing a great job on the bottom line, so we'll let you do what you want or have fun, go out there and do the Digital Geneva Convention, go to Davos, be sort of thought leader, as long as the bottom line is okay. But then when he goes, does it go?
That's a very interesting question and difficult to see. Probably there will be an assessment on the focuses of his work after he's not holding the position. But we could see that what has been built, the structures within Microsoft, the teams that have been formed, focusing on cyber diplomacy, and also the UN Affairs Office that was recently opened in New York, that there was the opening of
Microsoft UN
exactly
office.
Exactly. So Microsoft very strongly moving forward with this discussion, what I mentioned, the quasi-diplomatic actor. So if you have a UN affairs office in Microsoft, and of course, and if you read about it, you see that it's not only about cyber norms, it is supporting the UN on so many different levels and so many different topics with capacity building and helping with technology and all that.
Who is number two behind Microsoft? Is there a number two, and are they anywhere near to Microsoft in terms of their engagement at the corporate level?
This is a very good question, and I would say there is no number two. My research shows that you have a number of different private sector entities that pop up here and there, but there is no one with such consistent engagement. Right. However, you need to take into account that you have different organizations.
It's fascinating.
Well,
yeah, I agree with you, but when you think about it, I mean, where's Apple? Where's Google? Where's
exactly
Facebook? I mean,
exactly, and this is what I meant with my comment here. This imbalance. So you have an imbalance there. You have, in a way, like great interest from the private sector, and then yet you have one actor that is so dominating. However, I must underline that there are different organizations there, and they have many hundreds of members. So you could say that those organizations are also presenting their members, but nevertheless, none of these organizations are being that active as Microsoft. If we bring an example from the private sector, maybe Kaspersky is the one from whom we have seen like similarly consistent presence. But none of the others, no, Google, no, Facebook, no.
Yeah, and on the non-corporate side, civil society, I mean,
yeah, from the civil society, you have more actors. You have different think tanks related to cybersecurity. You have different leagues, issues. For example, the international discussions on international humanitarian law and how IHL applies to cyberspace. So specific topics are there. But
and who are the leaders there?
The leaders there. Some of them have direct connection with Microsoft. So Cyber Peace Institute, for example, you have the same organizations, Tech Accord that I already mentioned. So here you have like a bit of a pattern being visible, but you also have the Red Cross focusing on IHL and issues. You also have specific organizations focusing on standards and internet governance. But most active, clearly there is one player.
Microsoft learned a hard lesson in the 90s. When it, not unlike many tech companies here in Silicon Valley until relatively recently, thought it could just ignore policy, right? And then sort of the laissez-faire ethos that certainly has dominated the United States, but even to some extent in Europe, would prevail, and they wouldn't need to think about government. Well, then they started getting hammered by antitrust complaints in the 1990s, which led to a debate about monoculture, whether Microsoft's dominance would give rise to security, concentrated security risk. And it reacted in part by dramatically expanding its government affairs operations globally. Right. And so it has this muscle memory that's built up over 20 years.
As a nation state focused lobbying, pure lobbying, get a good law passed to prevent a bad law from passing. It was pure lobbying. What Brad Smith is doing is something very different in that.
But how? I mean, I have to ask the question that.
I mean, well, I see it as different, but also don't ignore the question here.
No, I would just, before getting there, I would just like to respond. I think this is absolutely very true. And this is what I was trying to say, that you have cyber diplomacy, you have this advocacy lobbying. And advocacy lobbying, like you said, they are very targeted, right? They're targeted against a specific regulation, specific initiatives. You can see this happening in Brussels a lot. You have many lobby groups with EU regulation things, and there you see Google active, there you see Facebook active, right? So this is really another level of getting the UN international. So this is why I think the argument is true that Microsoft is not only driven by profit. There are other values behind this. Do the cybersecurity activities of the UN Chartered International Telecommunication Union provide examples of cyber diplomacy involving the private sector? Absolutely. So just this morning, I had the interview with two gentlemen involved in the Internet Governance Forum. And there, the role of the private sector is very clearly seen, and the private sector entities and the NGOs are more active, even more active than at the first committee initiatives. So Internet Governance Forum is a very valid example. And
the IGF is different from the ITU.
Yes, but the ITU, well, it is more related with what the ITU is doing. So IGF is I think more closely with telecommunication issues than the first committee. The first committee does not deal with internet governance at all. However, the discussion we had this morning with the two gentlemen, it focused on the issues on internet governance in the IGF, and then issues in the first committee talking about national security, about their overlap, and about whether there's point to have two separate systems. If you would say that the non-stakeholder actors are very similar who are involved, or whether we should try to unite these things. And again, getting to the same point that there's no point of having multiple parallel duplicated processes, because this is not effective. So what their argument is that somehow to use the group of stakeholders involved, the mechanisms created to make the open-ended working group process more effective. However, the governments are not really buying into that idea, because for them, first committee is about security. Security is one thing, internet governance is another thing. So this is currently a completely gray area in terms of how to proceed. But there is clearly a need to have a better approach in the open-ended working group of involving the stakeholders, because the current situation is pretty much stalled. Are there any more questions from the audience? I think I see it from my computer. This was directly to.
I have a gazillion questions because it's a fascinating topic, but I want to yield to folks on the Zoom if others jump in. Let me pose one and then encourage and welcome people online to pose questions. Where would you say the multi-stakeholder model has worked? And when I raise that, I say not only for internet, and not only for cyber, or not only for cybersecurity, but environmental, labor standards, child labor standards,
international anti-landmine movements, right? Yeah.
Where are there? Can you say, here's a way in which, because let me say my own prejudices. To me, the IGF is just a big talk fest. And in fact, it has no decision-making power, I think. It used to. The ITU, on the other hand, is government-dominated. It's a treaty-based organization, and I think it's one country, one vote in the ITU. I can differ, and that's a whole can of worms. But breaking away from ICT, have you looked at, have you thought about where else multi-stakeholder has been tried?
I think this is a great question. Thank you for this. And I think the area where it's clearly seen that the multi-stakeholder approach is working alive and well is in the domain of trade. And WTO, and the process is ongoing there. So the multi-stakeholder approach,
it's also treaty-based and one country, one vote, but still.
Exactly. So the article I'm referring to here, Hawking, this is the domain he bases his multi-stakeholder diplomacy theory on the trade negotiations. And I'm not an expert in that on that topic, but I've done preliminary research, and there are articles saying that this is really the first kind of instance where we have the role of the private sector so clearly visible and so clearly accepted by the states.
Well, and there, it's an interesting question about then, okay, what are the elements of success, or what are the factors that contribute to success? What little I know about WTO is, one of the big issues is, when do the non-governmental entities see drafts of documents, and what is the access to drafts? And so in thinking about the sort of multi-stakeholder process, to me, that's a critical question. And sort of what goes behind closed doors when it's only governments versus what's a truly open list. And I know nothing more about WTO except for the fact that there's who gets the bootleg copy of the draft at what time. And
Well, there are, I know the US government has consultative mechanisms where drafts are shared, but there are also dialogues on, okay, how would your industry be impacted by this change?
Yeah.
And negotiators can come in and have a sense of, it's a negotiation, there's a pie, right? And there's a give and take element to trade negotiations where, okay, I liberalize this part of my, I'm gonna simplify this, but I liberalize this part of my economy in exchange for you liberalizing this. Is that roughly equal trade? To make that assessment, to understand the impact. And then there's, in some countries like the US, right? Like those agreements have to go back to a Congress or a parliament for a decision. And if you don't have that insight in the negotiations as to how it might impact, the legislature might kill it based on lobbying.
Right.
What's interesting in this case, in the trade case, is you can kind of draw a straight line between between sort of the corporate self-interest that gets fed into the negotiations, and then negotiators trying to optimize across a set of competing values. I don't know if I see that in cyber diplomacy, though.
Well, yeah, I agree that you don't see it yet, and this has to do with what we describe of the imbalance of the actors. And if you would have all the strong actors, all the major global actors behind the table and all having their messages put forward, I think this would be somewhat different. But what is also something to consider is the level of governments and what they can play in this regard. So having a bilateral talks with the industry, for example, of their own country, or having bilateral negotiations with bigger companies and get the input from the private sector and put it to the table, to the negotiation table via that. However, my own experience from Estonia is that we tried, or the Estonian Minister of Foreign Affairs has tried to initiate such cooperation with the private sector. And there we kind of hit the wall in the sense that the private sector in Estonia, they are small companies, they're not Facebook, right? And they're saying, I'm so busy, why should I bother, right? I don't have money, why should I send someone to, spend their days looking at this huge pile of documents, listening to hours and hours of negotiations? Why? What do I get from it? So yeah, I think it's different because I think the trade issues clearly very, very important for all the companies who are involved there. But cybersecurity norms, it seems to sound like a nice to have topic.
Yeah. I wonder if standards, standards development may be interesting, because they're, those are, you have both governments and the private sector bringing a set of ideas to the table, and then the criteria are, in theory, are supposed to be, is the proposed standard, does it meet, is it technically sound from an engineering standpoint, right? Is it which at least purports to have some objectivity to it.
Will it work on the ground in bits and bytes, and when you get down to the copper or fiber, will it work?
Yeah.
No, I completely agree with the important role of standards, and we've discussed this before, and I absolutely think and agree with you that when it comes to new technology, emerging tech, cybersecurity, standards have a huge role to play. It is difficult for countries to resort to legally binding agreements. So standards are, so to say, we can call it soft law, that could be a step towards regulation. The problem with standards and the issues of revolving around standards and then putting it into the context of foreign policy is the level of detail and the technical knowledge you need to have. So the diplomats working in the ministries of foreign affairs, this is really not these are not the discussions they can substantially contribute to. So this is, again, some sort of a paradox that you can have these negotiations on a multilateral level on issues that are comfortable for the officials of the states. And the moment you go into more technical discussions, you are losing your audience. You are losing the people around the table, which is such a pity, right? Because when we talk about cybersecurity, then these technical elements and details are so necessary. So again, we have this situation where we need the expertise and knowledge and input from the private sector who holds this expertise, without which we cannot have these negotiations.
No, I hear what you're saying, but I mean, if you look at the Microsoft proposal for the Digital Geneva Convention, there's nothing technical there. It's no first use, or don't attack critical infrastructure, or make sure your weapons are proportionate and targeted. I mean,
What governments have actually more experience and expertise on those topics than Microsoft?
right.
Interesting, yeah. Huh.
No, I would like counter argument for you. I love this discussion. Is that in my mind, the Digital Geneva Convention is precisely designed for the governments, and this is why it doesn't have such content.
No, right, I agree.
So
But when you talk about the input of the private sector, what Microsoft is bringing to the table on that discussion is not technical expertise.
Yes, because if it would, then people would be like deaf. They wouldn't understand.
Right. Now, if it's about crypto control and 56-bit, 128-bit, whatever, all those debates of what's an hour, what's in, what's out, how you do that definition, fine. You need technical understanding. But here, for the cybersecurity norms to Microsoft, it's not a technical issue. You could say it's a business issue, but it's not technical. So the company is not bringing technical expertise. It's a fascinating question that, you say, well, why do you want multi-stakeholders? You want multi-stakeholders to bring in the business expertise, the technical expertise, the human rights perspective, the civilian citizen perspective. And yet what Microsoft is bringing on that debate is actually something that's traditionally the province of governments, which is the sort of big picture, moral, sort of what's good for the world kind of perspective.
I would still argue that they're doing this not because that it wouldn't be necessary, but because this is the content that would get them more involved in these discussions.
Absolutely.
Like the same situation we can see with international law. There is so much to discuss at the UN level about the interpretation of international law, but because the people around the table are not experts, then you cannot even go there. Right? So it is the audience, so to say, limits your input in a way.
Right.
Yeah.
That's it.
Well, we have about 2 minutes left. I don't know, Anna Maria, if you want to, is there anything you want to say to close out? If there are other questions from the chat that people want to drop in before we wrap up at the hour? I would just like to thank everybody. There is one comment from Eva Osula. I'll just read it out. I fully agree with what is said, and major problem is skills, which are lacking in many levels, plus listening and engaging expert is lacking too, as there is a lack of experts, but also willingness to listen. And cyber is really a kind of nice to have. And I've been pulling this for years. It's really hard. Having discussions also with private sector is challenging. Why bother and waste money? Yeah, thank you, Eva, for pointing this out. And this really reflects too many of the things we've already said and discussed here today. So I agree with you. I just wonder, Eva, what is your background? You're saying that you've been pushing and pulling this for years. If you want to say something on via video or write to the chat, would be interesting to see where you're coming from. But just a concluding remark, thank you very much. Very happy to discuss further these issues. I have glass of something, coffee or something else, and to discuss these issues further, because I think in this particular research domain, it is really important to talk to different people, because there's only so much you can get from written materials. So much more you get from personal experiences and viewpoints. So since I see there's no comment from Eva, feel free to. All right, Microsoft, great. Oh, great.
We can talk about it. Eva, please contact me. You have my emails. It would be great to discuss further. Thank you, everybody, for being here today, online, offline, physically, virtually. Thanks a lot, and thank you for your comments and questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great stuff.